I'm Director of the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies and Professor of Sociology here. And
I'm Ana-Christina Ramon. I'm the Assistant Director of the Bunche Center.
And we're the co-editors of Black LA, Black Los Angeles, American Dreams and Racial Realities, which Los Angeles as a city, but specifically about African Americans in Los Angeles. There have been a number of very interesting histories that have come out in the last 5-10 years or so. But most of them have tended to focus on relatively narrow bands of time, like maybe the 1940s or the civil rights era or whatever. But there hadn't really been a book that comprehensively dealt with all aspects of black life, and it really went back to the founding of the city in 1781. So we wanted to do that type of book, which would allow us to really gain a fuller understanding of kind of what's happening right now and why it's happening. And that was kind of the charge for the project. So what we did was we brought together a series of individuals who were interested in the whole idea of Black Los Angeles. And from the beginning, we didn't want this to be an ivory tower exercise. We didn't want it to be just about college professors and academics. We wanted to bring real people from the community into the process as well. So what we did was, in fact, maybe I should let you talk about that, because she took a lead in a lot of that process, organizing these working groups between the community and scholars to try to come up with, okay, if you're going to study something like Los Angeles and Black Los Angeles, what are the topics you need to look at? You want to just tell us a little bit about some of the groups?
So we had 5 themes that we had identified that we thought were important that we should bring together these working groups around. So they were cultural production, communities and neighborhoods, social justice, political participation, and religious life. And so the meetings that we had, this is a few years ago now, or actually probably about 5 years ago or so.
5 years ago.
Yeah. There was about 101 people that showed interest, just counting everyone, and most of those attended these working groups that we had over a year, that we had in the community and here at the center. And then after we met and discussed what were the topics that people thought were relevant and important to address in a book such as this, then we began to solicit other scholars and the scholars that were attending the working groups to actually do the research that was needed, or to work towards a chapter based on research that they were already doing. So we actually gave out research grants, and out of I think the 13 of the 15 final products are actually in the book of the research grants that we gave out. And there was a few students, and I think they were all from sociology. PhD students.
PhDs, yeah.
Yeah, that their dissertations, part of their dissertations are actually chapters in the book. And the rest of the scholars are from, schools all around this area, so Loyola Marymount, Cal State LA, Occidental. Obviously we have a lot of UCLA scholars. And so it was definitely comprehensive as we could, in terms of trying to get a lot of feedback and opinion and a scholarly research into it. And so just what Dr. Hahn was saying, then the proposal was submitted, and then the book was published last April. Actually, it came out a month before it was supposed to be released, but May 2010.
Yeah, so I'm cutting my ringer off here because I have a feeling that I'm going to be interrupted any second now. It's one of those days. It was a book that, well, first of all, it's an edited volume, so there are lots of contributors, which makes it somewhat unique in the sense that we were able to bring together expertise in a variety of different subjects. There were 25 contributors overall, and I guess 17 chapters if you count the introduction. And what we're gonna do is kind of give you a flavor for some of the things in the book by reading through the table of contents in a minute. And then we're gonna read a couple of excerpts from the book too, so you kind of get a feel for it, and then we're gonna open up for a Q&A. But I just want to tell you a few other things about what we were trying to do with the project. The center, the Bunche Center here is like a think tank, and we do research on the African American community. So we wanted the book to kind of reflect the range of activities we're engaged in here at the Bunche Center. So the first criterion we had was we wanted to produce something that was going to be radically interdisciplinary. We didn't want to do a book, I'm a sociologist, and I didn't want to do it just like a sociologist would do it. I wanted to make sure that there were political scientists involved, anthropologists, people from English, people from, say, public policy. We had a geographer who wrote a chapter to really kind of, come at this issue, historians, to come at this issue from a number of different disciplinary perspectives, and to hopefully present a picture that's a lot richer than you would get in most books that dealt with life in Black Los Angeles. The other thing that we wanted to do was to dispel some myths about Black Los Angeles, particularly given the fact that despite these recent histories that have come out, we've been arguing that Black LA has been understudied relative to other major Black metropolitan areas in the country, like say Chicago or Philadelphia, that have all spawned important studies over the years. So we wanted to kind of give LA its due and to really kind of understand that history and where it came from. And there were some interesting findings that most people probably don't know, that come out of the book, and we can talk about some of those. But just to kind of give you a sense of substantively what made it into the book, because you can't possibly tell the story of a whole city and its history in just a single book. So we had to make some tough choices. But these are some of the things that make it into the book. I'm going to read you an excerpt from the introduction called Dreaming of Blackness, Los Angeles. But the book is basically divided into 3 parts. The first part is called Space. And the idea here is to kind of lay out the geography of Los Angeles and to kind of locate Black people in that geography over time, because it does change over time. It's not the same now as it was back in 1781 or even in 1920. There's been a lot of changes in terms of the space of LA. The second part of the book is called People, and it deals with particular groups of people in Black Los Angeles who've confronted some pretty interesting challenges and how they've dealt with those. And that's kind of the theme that holds those chapters together. And then part 3 of the book is called Image. It deals with representations of Black Los Angeles in the media and popular culture that the rest of the world has sort of taken in to kind of shape the way it thinks about Black LA. And at the same time, the people in Los Angeles have taken in that shapes the way they think about their own community. So there are several chapters, in fact 5 chapters in that section that deal with issues of image. And last but not least, part 4 of the book is called Action. And here we really wanted to produce a series of studies that could be used to empower the community. In other words, okay, we know all this stuff now about history, we know about space, we know about people and image. Well, what do we do? What do we do moving forward? So what we do in the last section of the book, we present 4 chapters that are examples of case studies of successful interventions, political interventions, organizations of certain sorts that dealt with these particular problems that came up. So let me just read through really quickly some of the titles to kind of give you a sense of it, and then we're going to read our excerpts and then open up for any questions you may have. Part 1, Space. The first chapter, Race, Space, and the Evolution of Black Los Angeles. A huge overview from 1781 to the present, kind of laying out the landscape. Chapter 2, From Central Avenue to Leimert Park, the shifting center of Black Los Angeles. Chapter 3, The Decline of a Black Community by the Sea, Demographic and Political Changes in Oakwood. Part 2, People. Chapter 4, Blowing Up at Project Globe, Rap Dreams and Young Black Men. Chapter 5, Out of the Void, Street Gangs in Black Los Angeles. Chapter 6, Imprisoning the Family, Incarceration in Black Los Angeles. Chapter 7, Black and Gay in LA, the relationship Black lesbians and gay men have to their racial and religious communities. Part 3, Image. Chapter 8, Looking for the Hood and Finding Community, South Central, Race and Media. Chapter 9, Playing Ghetto, Black Actors, Stereotypes and Authenticity. Chapter 10, Before and After Watts, Black Art in Los Angeles. Chapter 11, Solar, The History of the Sounds of Los Angeles Records. Chapter 12, Killing Killer King, The Los Angeles Times and the Troubled Hospital in the Hood. This is a chapter that Dr. Ramon and I co-authored. We can talk more about that. You can certainly ask us questions about it. Part 4, Action. Chapter 13, Bass to Bass, Relative Freedom and Womanist Leadership in Black Los Angeles. Chapter 14, Concerned Citizens, Environmental Injustice in Black Los Angeles. Chapter 15, A Common Project for a Just Society, Black Labor in Los Angeles. And Chapter 16, Reclaiming UCLA, The Education Crisis in Black Los Angeles, another chapter that Dr. Ramon and I co-authored that we can talk about as well. So what I thought we'd do here is just read some excerpts. I'm going to read an excerpt from the introduction that kind of gives you a flavor for the book. I think you're going to read an excerpt from the last chapter we did on UCLA, right? Okay, and then we'll just open up for questions you may have. Okay, this comes from the introduction of the book that's called Dreaming of Black Los Angeles. And it's from the last section of the introduction called The Dream of Black Los Angeles. In Colored California, an article published in the 1913 issue of The Crisis, W.E.B. Du Bois writes about his first visit to Los Angeles. What immediately strikes the reader about the piece is the exuberance with which Du Bois, the era's eminent scholar of race, describes the promise that Los Angeles holds for black people. 60 years before Baldwin Hills would become a signature black residential space, and there's a sort of the opening of this introduction talks about Baldwin Hills and kind of compares it to the BET show of the same name, a reality show that was on television a few years ago. 60 years before Baldwin Hills becomes a black signature space, Du Bois had already proclaimed Los Angeles as something of a housing mecca for blacks. Speaking of the black residents who greeted him in Los Angeles, he writes, quote, "They are without doubt the most beautifully housed group of colored people in the United States," unquote. Du Bois goes on to devote considerable space in the article to several images that showcase the smart homes of enterprising black residents. Indeed, one such image of the, quote, "beautiful home of Mr. and Mrs. William Foster," unquote, adorns the issue's cover. But Du Bois concedes the city was no racial paradise. Quote, "The color line is there and sharply drawn," unquote, he notes. He then describes the segregationist practices that organized public life in the city, much as they did in other cities throughout America during the period. Quote, "Women have had difficulty in having gloves and shoes fitted at the stores. The hotels do not welcome colored people. The restaurants are not for all that hunger," unquote. Du Bois' observations about the early color line in Los Angeles are echoed in the 1936 doctoral dissertation of a young black man who studied at the University of Southern California, the predominantly white private university about 2 miles from the center of Los Angeles' black community of the day. Max Bond, uncle of future NAACP chairman Julian Bond, explains that Los Angeles' color line began to harden around the time of Du Bois' visit, as more and more enterprising blacks migrated to the city. Quote, "Many old settlers report that 20 years ago, Negroes were welcome patrons of the many downtown establishments. They could receive service at any of the downtown restaurants and hotels. The change in attitudes occurred, as had been mentioned, after large increases in the population took place." It goes without saying that Los Angeles' color line, all its peculiarity and typicality, is a hulking presence in each of the chapters presented in this book. For example, Andrew Diener's ethnography of Oakwood, the chapter of I believe it's the 3rd chapter that I talked about earlier, chronicles how Los Angeles' color line of the early 1900s resulted in the establishment of one of the earliest communities of black homeowners in the city, a seaside enclave that was in decline by the early 2000s due to the dynamics of a racial real estate market specific to another era. In Chapter 2, Reginald Chappell examines how Los Angeles' color line also led to the establishment of the city's signature black community of the early 20th century, Central Avenue, as well as to the rise of Leimert Park, which eventually replaced Central Avenue as the cultural hub of black Los Angeles in the late 1960s. Paul Van Bloom's chapter on the history of black visual art in Los Angeles, Chapter 10, underscores the centrality that Leimert Park assumed in the racialized art world, while Ju Young Lee's chapter explores the experiences of aspiring young black male rappers who gravitated to Leimert Park cultural scene in lieu of other opportunities for success, and that's Chapter 4. Despite the reality of the color line throughout the city's history, an air of excitement permeates Du Bois' writing about Los Angeles he encountered in 1913. One gets the sense that in an era constrained by the dictates of Jim Crow, he saw possibilities for black people in the city. Not only did there appear to be a reasonably high level of racial comity between the city's black and white residents, but the black residents did not strike him as accommodationists inclined to settle for their racial subordination. Quote, "The better class of people, colored and white, can and do meet each other. There's a great deal of cooperation and goodwill, and the black folk are fighters and not followers of the doctrine of surrender," unquote. Apparently, Du Bois wasn't alone in his optimism. Los Angeles became an increasingly popular destination for Black Americans throughout the first half of the 20th century. As Edna Bonasich, Lola Smallwood Cuevas, Lanita Morris, Stephen Pitts, and Joshua Bloom note in chapter 15, many of these migrants were pushed out of the South and pulled into Los Angeles because of the growing city's reputation of affording more opportunities for Black employment. Still, there seemed to be something more fundamental to the allure of Los Angeles in the Black imagination, something more formative about Black expectations regarding the group's place in the city. Park and Burgess's classic volume, The City, provides us with insight here when it looks beyond the material factors of the metropolis typically captured in maps and statistics and considers the city as, quote, a state of mind. This approach pays particular attention to the, quote, body of customs and traditions and of the organized attitudes and sentiments unique to Los Angeles. Black Los Angeles, as Park and Burgess might put it, is not, quote, merely a physical mechanism in an artificial construction. It is involved in the vital processes of the people who compose it. It is a product of nature and particularly of human nature. A unique state of mind, as well as distinctive history and ethos, indeed seems to have permeated what we think of as Black Los Angeles. Not only was California named for the mythical Black Amazonian queen, Califia, but more than half of the Spanish founders of the city in 1781, as Paul Robinson shows in chapter 1, were of African descent. Moreover, because California was admitted to the Union as a free state in 1850, a fact that Du Bois underscores in his article Free the Crisis, the foundation was laid for a rather peculiar and flexible racial order in the region. At the same time, the pioneering spirit associated with the opening of the West likely tickled the Black migrants' imagination as well. Blacks who came west from more settled and rigidly racist regions of the country clearly saw promise in the growing city, a place where it might actually be possible for Blacks to realize the American dream. But as the Black population of Los Angeles swelled with the influx of migrants from Texas, Louisiana, and elsewhere during the first half of the 20th century, racial realities more reflective of the Jim Crow South soon followed, eventually challenging the dream that so many had hoped to find in the growing metropolis. By the latter part of the 20th century, prospects seemed more mixed than in Du Bois's day. The urban uprisings of 1965 and 1992, as well as the diminished opportunities associated with those living in communities like the Jungle, which is the nickname of this apartment complex that kind of borders Baldwin Hills, which is more upscale, stood side by side with Black overrepresentation among local elected officials and the enviable lifestyles of Black Angelenos living in places like Baldwin Hills. At the same time, a steady stream of immigrants from Central and South America, Asia, and elsewhere had transformed Los Angeles into one of the world's most diverse cities by the last decades of the 20th century, a multicultural maze, some Blacks feared, which threatened the political clout enjoyed by the region's large Black population. Although the county of Los Angeles boasted the second largest Black population in the nation in 2007, nearly 1 million people, this population represented a relatively small 9.5% of the county's overall population. Not long after the University of California established a southern branch in Los Angeles in 1919, it enrolled its perhaps its most celebrated alumnus. A young Ralph Bunche, who would go on to become the first African American awarded the Nobel Prize in 1950, became the valedictorian of the school's 1927 class. UCLA would have important connections to the Black Los Angeles community from its beginnings, educating many of the city's Black luminaries, including Bunche, the color barrier transcending Jackie Robinson, and Los Angeles' second Black mayor, Tom Bradley. And we talk about that in chapter 1. And there was actually a mayor during the Spanish period who was of African descent, who obviously came before Tom Bradley, among many others. But by the early years of the 21st century, as Ana-Christina Ramon and I examined in chapter 16, the local chapters of the National Urban League, NAACP, and other community-based advocacy groups would be forced to form an alliance to challenge campus admissions policies that threaten to erase the Black student presence from the publicly funded campus. Nonetheless, the dream of better life lived on for many Black Angelenos, despite the often harsh social and economic realities some confronted in the city. For all the Black families in Los Angeles able, for example, to celebrate the academic achievement of their young ones, there were others forced to endure hardships associated with maintaining ties to loved ones behind bars, like the families interviewed by Belinda Tucker, Never Pemberton, Mary Weaver, Gwendolyn Rivera, and Carrie Petrucci in Chapter 6. While members of the Black gay community studied by Mignon Moore in Chapter 7 negotiated their places in Black Los Angeles, others wrestled with environmental justice issues that, as Sonia Winton reveals in Chapter 14, were largely ignored by mainstream environmental groups. To be sure, the struggle between American dreams and racial realities in Los Angeles continued in the early 21st century. In the final analysis, this book aims to address several critical questions associated with the struggle. What is the nature of the Black in the space we refer to as Black Los Angeles? How can the history of a place be employed to make sense of the racial present? What lessons can be learned that might help make Black dreams of a brighter future a reality in the region and beyond? And what can the case of Black Los Angeles teach us about race in America? Black Los Angeles is and has always been a space of profound contradictions. Just as Los Angeles has come to symbolize the complexities of the early 21st century city, so too has Black Los Angeles come to embody the complex realities of race in so-called colorblind times. And that's the excerpt I'm going to read from the introduction. I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Ramon to read from our final chapter on UCLA.
So just to give you background on our final chapter that's in the book, Chapter 16, Reclaiming UCLA, Education Crisis in Black Los Angeles. Here at the Bunche Center, as I think most of you know, but just in case, we're an organized research unit at UCLA. And so we have been working on this research project since 2002 called the College Access Project for African Americans. And it was funded by the Ford Foundation. It was a $700,000 grant. And so we have been studying equity and access issues for African Americans particularly after Prop 209's passage, which eliminated affirmative action. And so the numbers have been dropping in terms of admissions for African American undergraduates since Prop 209 had passed. But in 2006, the enrollment numbers were particularly low, and it was numbers that hadn't been seen since the 60s. And so what we discussed, though, in this chapter is the issue with this education crisis, but also the reaction and the community action that took place, which we think then is very important and has like an important message that we wanted to relay in addition to just the research of knowing what's going on with the admissions process. We wanted to also discuss how important community action is and how that can create change. So I'll just give a quick reading of just the first couple of pages, just to give you more of an idea, and we can talk about this further. UCLA, which boasts such storied Black alumni as Jackie Robinson, Tom Bradley, and Ralph Bunche, and is in a county that is 9.8% African American, now has a lower percentage of Black freshmen than either crosstown rival USC or UC Berkeley, the school often considered its top competitor within the UC system. On a Sunday morning in June 2006, Los Angeles woke up to the above words under the headline, quote, "A startling statistic at UCLA." Media throughout the nation soon picked up the news, reigniting a long-standing debate about higher education, race, and access. For much of the city's Black community, the revelation that fewer than 100 African Americans were expected to enroll in a freshman class of more than 4,900 students was indeed startling. Black students stood to account for only about 2% of the freshman class at the University of California, Los Angeles, a public university located in a county where Blacks made up nearly 10% of the population. For those better acquainted with UCLA, the news was not really all that new. This latest crisis reported in the pages of the Los Angeles Times was merely reflective of a promising yet often disappointing relationship between Black Angelenos and the campus that could be traced to the origin of that relationship. UCLA was a place of contrast for Black Angelenos. Established near Hollywood in 1919 when Black Los Angeles was experiencing tremendous growth, as mentioned earlier from the Crisis magazine, the campus relocated farther west to what would become the exclusive white enclave of Westwood in 1929. Just as the Central Avenue Black community was coming into its own. Yet in times when traditionally white colleges typically excluded blacks and other minorities, UCLA was known for producing black luminaries and pioneers such as Dr. Ralph J. Bunche, Jackie Robinson, and Tom Bradley. In 1949, 5 years before the Supreme Court rendered Jim Crow unconstitutional with its landmark Brown versus Board decision, UCLA became the first predominantly white college in the nation to elect a black, Cheryl Luke, as student body president. But like Los Angeles, UCLA was never a racial paradise. Beneath the veneer of UCLA's proud legacy of black achievement were the realities of a pre-Civil Rights Act America. Token blacks admitted largely because of their athletic prowess and unacceptable levels of segregation and alienation on campus. Still, UCLA was a symbol of promise for blacks from Los Angeles and elsewhere who saw access to a first-rate college education and a better future for themselves. Because of its association with black pioneers, UCLA represented a prime path to an American dream for many blacks. Perhaps it is no accident that as the Black Power movement challenged the status quo at traditionally white campuses across America in the mid-1960s, UCLA again would lead the way as black Angelenos proclaimed the campus their own, pushing for what became a model program for opening the campus to inner-city minorities with high potential, and organizing for the establishment of one of the nation's first black studies research centers, which is now the Bunche Center. So it seemed quite ironic that in the spring of 2006, in the afterglow of this legacy, and when the county of Los Angeles boasted the second largest black population in the nation, that the Los Angeles Times could report such a startling statistic about black admissions and enrollments at the campus. The day after the startling statistic became news, a coalition of African American community organizations in Los Angeles came together in order to demand equity for black students applying to UCLA. The group's action was reminiscent of organized efforts during the civil rights and black power periods, which was fitting given that the number of expected black enrollees to the campus had dropped to levels not seen since the 1960s. Unlike any other education-focused coalition that Black Los Angeles had seen in decades, the group brought together mainline civil rights organizations and other community-based organizations in the city that had traditionally pursued their own separate agendas in different ways. The group called itself the Alliance for Equal Opportunity in Education. We here at the Bunche Center served as consultants to the AEOE, providing the group with data from our Bunche Research Report series on the education crisis confronting black students in California, which the group used to develop its case for progressive change. The AEOE's crusade quickly produced results when UCLA switched to a fair admission system the following year and doubled its black enrollment. So the rest of the chapter then looks at the process that the Alliance or the AEOE took to actually create change, and how that coalition that they built then also maintained itself, and to this day it still meets weekly, and it's still working on education issues in Los Angeles, in addition to the undergraduate admissions crisis.
So with that, we'd like to open it up for any questions or comments you may have. Hopefully we can have a dialogue for the time we have remaining about either of the pieces we read or any other topics that emerged from the book that we referred to when I went through the table of contents. Yes?
Is there going to be another version of the book with added chapters? And what were some of the hard chapters to leave out of this edition of the book?
Well, all of these chapters were commissioned, meaning that once we decided what we wanted to cover, we had to find a scholar who could write the chapter. So there weren't any chapters written that we decided, nah, we're going to leave that one out. We can do that. However, there were ideas and themes and topics we talked about in the working groups that were really good ideas, but we just couldn't do because we knew that we could only do so many chapters in the book. And we had a pretty strict, word limit from the publisher, NYU Press. And when Christina and I lost the whole holiday season, and we were editing, the manuscript, and lo and behold, we were 60,000 words over budget at one point, and had to go back and make all of the contributors mad at us by saying, we're gonna have to take 5 pages out of your chapter and that type of thing to kind of fit this into, a manageable size. So to answer your question, there's a lot of information that didn't make it into the book, and so one of the things that we're working on now to kind of supplement the book is a digital archive of material on Black Los Angeles, much of which we'll put on the web for other researchers who want to access it. A lot of the stuff we have here in our library and media center somewhere and other stuff, and there's like hundreds and hundreds of photos that don't make it into the book, even though there are lots of photos in the book, there are hundreds that didn't make it. Graphs, charts, all kinds of material that didn't make it into the book that will be part of the digital archive that hopefully you'll be able to search and, and continue the research project. So the whole idea of the Black LA Research Project continues, even though this particular volume is done.
Did we answer your question with
Yeah.
another part? I can't.
Well, I was wondering, you said, you kind of answered it, there's going to be a future edition.
Oh, well, you never know. I mean, never say never. I mean, we're not actually working on one now because, of course, it took us 8 years to produce this one, and I would actually say the writing was about 2 years.
Yeah.
Would you say, from the time that we commissioned the first studies, and the chapters went through extensive editing because one of the things we were trying to do was make sure that you have all these people writing on their own particular topic. We wanted to make sure that the chapters kind of talk to each other. That if something was brought up in one chapter, it was sort of referenced in a meaningful way in another chapter. So that it didn't feel like you're reading the chapters; it feels repetitive, or if something's mentioned in passing, you can't figure out what it is. So there was a lot of editing that was done after things were first submitted to make sure that the chapters kind of fit together. So it was a timely process. And so if we were going to do another book, it was 2011 now. I mean, the earliest it could possibly come out would be like 2014.
Yeah.
And that's assuming that we even had a plan to move forward, because it takes that long to produce.
But we're still doing research, though,
But yeah,
obviously, on the topic. Yeah.
Research continues. Yes?
Is there a class for this, or a lecture, or is there a...
Well, funny you should mention that. I'm actually teaching, I'm teaching, it's a course called Social Organization of Black Community. It's Afro-Am and Sociology cross-listed course, M5. And
that's
students here
what
now. We've actually assigned the book for that class. And so, in fact, it's the last book we're reading because, this is a case study, basically, of community organization, over time. And the class kind of deals with everything going back to slavery to the present, but using sort of LA, Black LA, as the case study at the end of the course. But there is no single course at this point centered around this book.
But there may be in the future.
But there could be in the future, because I mean, the original idea was to kind of keep the project going and to actually have a class that kind of follows where the project goes and actually have students get involved in doing some of the research. Yeah.
What's my question is like how to get this information to a different scope of audience, like a different, because like we could read this all day, but we really need to know what's in it. Like aren't gonna read this book.
Right.
Yeah, and we've actually talked about that with the Southern California Library. They're a community library, and so we're actually trying to find ways to work with them so that we could, we need the funding though first, but we want to create lesson plans, and so they could be community lesson plans, and then K through 12 lesson plans that are created out of this, from this book. So that anybody could. I mean, we actually hope that this book could be read by everyone in the community, so it's not abstract and full of jargon. The theory is in there, the academic theory, but we try to make it so that it's something that's accessible to everyone.
One of the rules of thumb we had when we conceived of the project was, and we told this to all of the contributors, it's a scholarly book. It's going to be published by a scholarly press. It'll probably be used in undergraduate and graduate courses. But, the rule of thumb is, can your mom pick this up and read it? If she can't, then you're too jargony, because we're trying to create this so that people in the community can actually use it to empower themselves. So a lot of the sociology, anthropology, or political science is in the footnotes. And so the text itself is meant to read more like a story, but the data is all in there, and the references are in there.
But yeah, and we understand though that it might not be as, then somebody doesn't want to read something that's this many pages or whatever. So we're working towards, if we can get the funding to create lesson plans that break down each of the chapters and topics.
For different grade levels.
Yeah.
Because we really would like to ideally work with OLA Unified to see if there's a way to bring it into the curriculum.
Kind of feeding off your question a little bit. So I think this is a really great piece of scholarship, and it's written in a way that is very understandable. It's not too abstract or alienating. And I think, you know, it's been received as a really important contribution to what is Black identity and the Black experience in LA by, you know, a different community, more of like a scholarly community, but also a local one. I'm curious what your thought on the movie Crash was, and it's because of, I think that was a big point about, you know, some people's interpretation of the experience in LA, and you know, do you think it's accurate, and do you think it's at odds, and what do you think of it, if you have any comments?
Yeah, he has a lot of comments.
Well, first of all, let me just caveat, I haven't seen Crash in, fortunately, in many years. So I can't remember the details, but I'll just say that my immediate reaction was I hated the film. And I thought that it was overly simplistic. It kind of trivialized the sources of racial conflict and kind of put it on this individual sort of, you know, prejudice level that if people just understood each other better, the world would be a wonderful place. I'm a sociologist. I believe in social structures and, you know, things like poverty and inequality, and they create tensions that lead to the prejudices people have. It's not the other way around. The arrow points this way, not that way. So I think the movie completely misses the point. I was actually on a panel with the director, a panel that Reverend James Lawson, a name that some of my students may know, because he's mentioned in one of the books we're reading right now, in terms of, he was an important figure in the civil rights movement. And he put the panel together specifically to get at that issue, that, you know, what is the source of racial tension? Is it just that people have prejudices, or are there some other societal things going on? And obviously someone coming out of the civil rights movement is going to have a sensitivity to the structures. Well, he brought the director on to the panel, and he, you know, he's Australian, you know, and his experience here, I mean, you know, my sense was it was rather superficial, and I think it shows in the film. So for that reason, I didn't particularly like the film. I mean, you know, as a piece of cinematic work, I guess it has some values, you know, and it's nice to look at. It may be interesting and may have some drama, but the message I thought was not on point, you know, in terms of the social realities that we're dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, it was a little like simplistic, but I think just for, you know, movie effects or just to, yeah.
Well, I meant, you know, not,
Well, just to give you an example, one of the themes that kind of comes up over and over again in this book, since we haven't really talked much about some of the other chapters, is the relationship between blacks and Latinos in LA. And one of the things that keeps coming up is that blacks and Latinos have you know, centuries-old relationship in LA, and they've gotten along through most of that history, and they live side by side. And in some cases, they've even intermarried. You know, so there's been a lot of cultural mixing, and so all of this stuff about, you know, tensions between blacks and Latinos has largely been constructed by media who are attempting to sort of capitalize off of, you know, conflict to sell, you know, newspapers, you know, viewers of television, the advertisers or whatever. And you're using immigration kind of as this wedge that you know, pits blacks against Latinos without looking at the bigger picture. Well, who's kind of orchestrating the whole process and who's benefiting from that process? That's the piece that's missing. So when you actually talk to blacks and Latinos, a lot of them get that. And I don't have anything against blacks and Latinos. You know, yeah, maybe we are competing for, in some instances, the same few available jobs, but, you know, why aren't there more jobs? Because they've been imported elsewhere, and so on and so on. Or this area has been deindustrialized. You know, so those things come up a lot, particularly in the black labor chapter. There's a whole chapter on the history of the labor movement in LA and the role that black people played in it. And you can't talk about that without talking about Latinos. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm removing my hat as a staff member for the Bunche Center.
Okay.
And I'm just a person in the audience. Wouldn't this also be the same thing that you just said about Crash, but at the opposite end, you're looking at it from a very simplistic point of view? And the reason I say that is because I have experience where there has been legitimate problems between African Americans and Latinos, and definitely when it comes to gang territory.
Oh yeah.
So those are legitimate. That's not orchestrated by the media or anything else.
Well,
so to say that there is not a problem, I think is overly simplistic.
No, I didn't say there wasn't a problem. I said the problem has been sort of overemphasized and exploited. And we do have a game chapter that deals with those issues. Yeah.
Okay.
Let's take a look at that.
And what exactly is
and so I guess the point is that there is a long history of peaceful and positive exchange between African Americans and Latinos in the Oakwood chapter, for example, very early in that period. And only when other factors crop up do the tensions begin to emerge. It's not because of anything, intrinsic to African Americans or Latino. It usually has to do with outside factors,
Okay.
That manipulate the relationship between the two groups, and then it's again manipulated by the media.
And like scarcity of resources
Yeah.
and so forth. And so,
Which is true, there are.
So if you go back far enough, there's no issue with that at all. I mean, it's just, it's just the way it was in LA, Particularly if you look at the early settlers of LA, I mean, they were basically Spanish and African in terms of descent.
And I have another point. Now you mentioned plans to have like lesson plans and to break it down to different educational levels to promote what's actually in the book to make it more palatable. Have you considered also doing a follow-up to some of the chapters, maybe in a lecture series where you would have maybe each one of the themes presented each quarter and have the authors come in and do a follow-up to what's going on? For example, you and Dr. Ramon maybe talk about what's an update of the King Hospital or an update of what the Educational Alliance is working on now, since those are the chapters that you wrote about.
I mean, that's an interesting idea. I don't know that we could pull it off every quarter because there's so many chapters and there'd be so much preparation involved in kind of updating each of them. But I mean, I think the idea of like Black LA 2 years later, type of thing might be a good idea. To put something together where we kind of update where things are 2 years after the book comes out. I think that could be cool. Yes.
Did anybody look into the allocation of law enforcement assets towards different neighborhoods throughout the years?
That wasn't something that comes up specifically in any of the chapters. The closest we get to that probably is in the chapter on incarceration. It talks about the way that different communities perceive the police force and sort of the justice system in general. So, I mean, that's a very important issue, obviously. It's just one of those issues that didn't make it into the book. I mean, there were lots of issues like that we wish we could have put in there, but we just couldn't do it. So we had to kind of make some tough choices.
A few years ago, the area, East Hollywood, was very bad. And then, big investors bought the buildings, and law enforcement came and cleaned up that area. And then it got really...
Well, actually, that's not true. There is a chapter that talks about that directly as a case study, though. It doesn't give you the big picture.
Yeah.
The Oakwood community.
Yes.
Oakwood went through a process. Does everybody know where Oakwood is? Oakwood is a community in Venice Beach. Oakwood is the area basically where blacks and Latinos, and this is an example of blacks and Latinos living side by side in the early 20th century, when Abbott Kinney, who developed Venice and the canals and all that kind of stuff, well, Venice was segregated more or less, and so all the workers and servants who built the canals and worked in Venice were forced to live in this one little several block area that later became known as Oakwood. And so the anomaly is, 100 years later or 80 years later, you have these descendants of servants and people who were laborers in the canals who owned houses who were worth over $1 million because they were close to the beach. And so you have this black home-owning neighborhood right on the beach, prime real estate. Of course, with the real estate collapse and financial crisis, probably not worth as much now. A lot of these people are probably underwater, but it's a whole other story. When the chapter was being written, this was still, prime real estate, so to speak. Well, the chapter talks about gentrification and what happens in that community and the decline of the community. A lot of the people living there who were black were in their 80s and 90s, because they had moved in the 20s and 30s. And were beginning to lose their homes to real estate speculators, people trying to basically sell your house to me, and they, of course, would bid the price, and they'd sell it for like an exorbitant amount to somebody who would come and tear down the house and build this multi-million-dollar high-rise, building with a big security gate around it because, of course, they wanted to lock out the rest of the riffraff from the community. Well, the chapter talks a lot about the LAPD and the role the LAPD played in that, and how once they had this drug gang warfare that was going on, largely due to drug sales, and there was tension between black and Latino gangs fighting for drug turf, basically, in Oakwood for many years, which depressed the housing values. So it became a relatively, cheap place to live and a good bargain for somebody who wanted to buy a house if you were willing to drive past the drive-bys, But what happened was when they started to gentrify the area, and wealthy whites started snapping up these properties for like under market values. Suddenly, LAPD's enforced. They have mobile units out, basically just sweeping the whole community and making it safe for these new residents. And they didn't see the need to do that before. You know what I mean? So it followed kind of the white presence when the LAPD presence came in. And of course, the people who were longtime residents resented the presence of the LAPD. So a lot of the chapters sort of like this in-depth interview with residents who lived there for 50 and 60 years and how they felt about people coming in and taking over their community. And at the same time interviewing some of the new residents. Well, I think if I can afford to buy the property, it should be my house. And so the whole question was, what does it do to the sense of community when you have people living next door to each other and they don't speak to each other, and one is kind of living by the graces of the LAPD and other people resent the LAPD. So that's kind of the focus of the chapter. So it gets at some of what you're, I think, talking about. Yeah.
Did you guys talk much about the Korean black thing? That I think that was more or less fabricated after Rocky.
1992, yeah.
Yeah, because
We do mention that story of
Natasha Harlan.
Yeah.
Comes up. Yeah, it comes up. That comes up in a couple of chapters, actually. Although there isn't a chapter per se on Korean black relations, it's kind of dealt with in passing, but kind of in the same way the Latino situation is. I mean, a lot of that stuff was blown out of proportion. The big issue was, why are there these ethnic tensions in the first place? Because of decreasing opportunities and for minority groups and competition over scarce resources, basically, the leftovers. That was a big part of it. Yeah, I wrote a book on the 1992 uprisings, years ago, but they're focusing more on media coverage of it. But those things came out again, and the people I interviewed who watched TV coverage and felt that it was inaccurate, slanted, and so forth and so on, and designed to kind of, highlight tensions between groups as opposed to looking at the bigger problems. So that's a theme that's in this book as well. Yes.
I'm not sure if you can answer this, or maybe it's too early to tell, but I'm curious to know the future of LA, if it will still be a black one, given things like gentrification and the rails that are becoming in, to the west side, and the migration patterns of different ethnic groups already within LA, given the last 20 years.
Yeah.
So looking forward, I mean.
Yeah. Chapter 1 actually tries to kind of get into that. A geographer wrote the chapter who also analyzed the census decade by decade to kind of look at trends over time. And the last census he was able to look at was the 2000 census, because the 2010 census hasn't officially come out yet, although we have projections. We know that, of course, the country is getting more diverse and all those types of things. But between 1990 and 2000 was the first decade, or the first census on record where the black population actually declined in LA. Only slight. It's a very slight decline. But that was largely due to the migration of blacks to other counties, like to Riverside and other places, and Fontana, and these communities where people moving out of South LA, where they were his argument was they were just the bad rep that South LA was getting because of 1992 and school educational opportunities and things like that, and then just wanting to be able to buy a family a home, get more home for your money by living 50 or 60 miles out and commuting in by rail, train, or whatever it is that people do to get to their job. And so it was a huge trend between 1990 and 2000, probably most of it after 1992, where a lot of that happened for blacks. But even with that trend, I mean, the population has been more or less stable. The decline was pretty small. So, I mean, let's say that trend continued. It's unlikely that it would continue given what's happening with the real estate market now, because a lot of what drove that was the real estate bubble that allowed people to be able to sell their home and buy a bigger house somewhere else. I mean, who's going to be able to do that now, So, I don't know. If I had to guess, I don't think we'd see that much significant decline in the numbers of the black population. Now, their percentage may continue to decline because the Latino population is growing so much more quickly, and with other immigrant groups coming in, but the actual numbers. I think LA County in 2010 will still be the second largest black population in the country, behind Cook County, which is where Chicago is. But one of the other things that may change is black elected officials. Blacks have traditionally been overrepresented among elected officials, well, certainly since the middle of the 20th century, and after the Voting Rights Act and all those things went into place. we've had black mayor, we've had black representation in the city council that's disproportionate to our population numbers, that type of thing. That may change as the Latino population becomes older and able to vote, because a large part of the Latino population, in earlier periods could not vote because they weren't legal citizens, and the Latino population tends to be younger than the black population because they tend to have more children, although not that much larger. I mean, black population has more children than the white population, which is one reason why the white population is the one that's shrinking the fastest in LA. So all things equal, more Latinos will probably be represented more in terms of electoral politics than blacks. So there may be a little decline there, for black elected officials. Yeah.
I have a question. This is to both of you. Now, you're both scholars. So what, for each one of you, starting with Ana-Christina, what was the one thing that you learned that really surprised you in all of the research that was going on? I took your question? Oh, I'm sorry. Raise your mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question because I've been asked this before actually, and I've always said that, like, obviously in education system today, K through 12, you don't really get a lot of ethnic studies history, and which is really sad, especially being in Los Angeles, growing up here, where I grew up, and the idea that half or a little over half of the founders of Los Angeles, or modern, I guess, more Los Angeles as a city, were of African descent is like something that people just don't know, I think. And so, it wasn't like surprising, but it was more like something that, wow, this is like a fact that people should know more about. And I think that just even having that history about the leaders and the historical background about the city, and how, like, there was a black woman that was a businesswoman, Biddy Mason, how she owned land and was a businesswoman. If people just knew more about that, then I think that they would appreciate the culture and history more, and just like have a better kind of idea about just how how embedded in African American population that this city has grown, like, because of African Americans. And so I think that's not really conveyed when you're in school, and so I think that's too bad.
Wow. I guess the thing that, well, at least I find most interesting is just the evolution of space over time in LA, and how, like, a place where we're sitting now, what was this place like? What was this location right here where we're sitting like 90 years ago? And how does that relate to different groups in LA, and why they were there, why they weren't there? So you can look at different communities that we kind of take for granted today, and 50 years ago they may have been completely different, and they all have these really interesting histories associated with them, and why it was that, say, there were no black people there at all, and maybe 20 years later there were nothing but black people. So that whole transition of space over time I find very interesting. And a lot of it's related to laws that, well, to racially restricted covenants that prevented people from selling your home to someone who wasn't white, things like that. It shaped different communities in LA. I mean, Baldwin Hills is a great example, and that we use that to open the book. In the 1950s, Baldwin Hills was newly white, and you couldn't live there if you were black. And in fact, I lived there and had the deed, like the original deed for my home, and it talks about, unless you're the gardeners, or, basically, it doesn't use the word gardeners. Let me see if I get the exact wording. Hold on for a second. Let's see here. And this is verbatim from the deed of the house.
Yeah, and I think that something like that, people weren't even aware that that was like allowed in California. They thought like, oh,
Okay, here we go.
those things only happen in the South.
So, okay, so the house was built in 1953, and on the deed was the following. Number one, no part of said realty shall ever be sold, conveyed, leased, or rented to any person not of the white or Caucasian race. Number two, no part of any said realty should ever at any time be used or occupied or permitted to be used or occupied by any person not of the white or Caucasian race, except such as are in the employ of the resident owner or resident tenants of said property. So in other words, housekeepers, maids, butlers, excluded. If you weren't white, you couldn't live here. And so that kind of shaped the topography of LA. And so one of the things the book shows is how decade by decade, different communities open up. Like West Adams suddenly becomes a place where prominent blacks move, and so you have movie stars and who can afford to live in West Adams, and but the white folks who are living there, who are pretty wealthy, don't want them living there, and eventually there are all these court struggles, and some of these restrictive covenants are overturned on the basis of these cases, and suddenly West Adams becomes a place where wealthy black people can move. And you just kind of see this westward movement of the population with these political changes over time. And so that's it's really eye-opening when you see it, and you think about it in the context of what was happening politically at those points in history, like after Brown versus Board of Education, and some of these other major turning points in racial and social history in the U.S. Yeah.
Were those things ever enforced?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah, they were enforced. Oh,
What
yeah.
year was that?
Absolutely. That was 1953. And I think that, I'm trying to remember what year those were. And see, the first thing that happened was they I'm trying to remember if I get this right. Well, it was a two-part process. I'm forgetting the order, but there were two different decisions. And the first one pretty much invalidated racially restrictive covenants. And I think the second one prevented them from being enforced, if that makes any sense. Because people were still trying to enforce them even after the court said that they weren't valid. And they just,
Yeah, exactly.
The Hollywood
It's just,
Cemetery.
And so like people like Tom Bradley, for example, when he moved, before he became mayor, he was in the police force, LAP, after he left UCLA in the late 1940s. He eventually bought a house in Leimert Park, when Leimert Park was virtually all white, and he had to have a white front family buy the house for him to move in. And that happened a lot. There were lots of people, that we have stories of people, I was a teenager when my family moved here from Chicago, and we were the first black family on the block, and we had a white realtor who bought the house, and we moved in, and people gave us funny looks, and there's stories like that in the book of people that were interviewed. We kind of talk about that, And you can see how, from neighborhood to neighborhood, how it changes over time, and what it took to get to that point. Yeah.
I guess where do you go now? Because this is blatant racist laws and everything, and it's history. But where do you go with this to explain or to help support hegemony, and just where does this fit in counteracting what's really going on now, which is hegemony, systematic exclusion, and all that stuff?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I kind of regret, but then I don't regret about the book, and nobody's ever asked me that, what thing do you regret most about the book? What would you do differently if you had more time? I really regret that we don't have a concluding chapter, that really tries to tie it all together. So I think the original idea was to kind of lay it out in the various sections, and then to kind of end it with these case studies of successful interventions. In each of the 4 chapters, give you examples of how the community organized to do something, that kind of speaks to the conditions that we described earlier in the book. The idea being, okay, you know the history now, you know what people are dealing with, and you know what some people did to do with it, so why don't you follow what they did and kind of come up with your own intervention? That's kind of the idea. It's kind of like you lead a horse to water, and then you hope that they drink. I wish we had written the final chapter, which actually tells them how to drink, but we didn't have words. We didn't have words to do it, and so yeah, we couldn't have done it anyway without dropping another chapter. And I prefer to kind of have the substantive chapters and let people draw their own conclusions. But to answer your question, that's what that final chapter would have done. And so I think that it's still there implicitly. I think that if you read the whole book from beginning to end, you kind of see the big picture, and it kind of comes together. And hopefully we think it inspires you, because you're like, wow, look what these people endured, and look what they were able to do. And then at the same time, here are some concrete things that people have done in the past, and and recently, like ending up with the UCLA example, that despite the odds worked, you know, and so then, you know, whatever I'm confronting, if I know the history, if I know the issues involved, then maybe we can figure out how to do something about this too. That's kind of what we hope that people will get.
And I think that's one of the things that when you were working on the book, that's what you really wanted. You wanted people to, you wanted to see the interaction of what people were going to come up with. Because I know that was the basis of the conference that you did on Black LA last year too. And where you had different groups of people come from throughout the city and hear their stories and their interaction. And not everyone agreed with what was in the book.
Or they didn't know because they hadn't read it yet, but.
But
I mean, the problem with the conference, I mean, again, in retrospect, if I would have done differently, we had a conference last May, right after the book was published, a big conference, and we had we had several panels of people talking about each section of the book. And so what we did was, for the panelists, we sent them advanced copies of that section before the book was actually published, giving them time to read it and then critique it and review it, you know, and talk about it on their panel. The problem was nobody in the audience had access to the book, except for on that day when we were selling the book, because it had just come out. And so they couldn't really, so they were critiquing things that were already in the book, you know, or like they were criticizing it for not having things that weren't in there because they hadn't read it yet. Largely because they were relying upon the critique of the panelists who read their section but didn't read the other sections, because we wanted them to focus on their section, which was kind of a problem because we kept finding ourselves saying, well, yeah, that's true, but in the earlier sections we did deal with that, blah, blah, blah. And so, you know, it was a good conference, I thought, but it could have been better if, the next time I do this, I would, you know, give everyone more access to the book in advance so that we spend a lot of time complaining about things that are really already covered in the book and focus more on the real gaps, you know. Yeah. So I hand it back. Okay, well, if, any more questions, or are we?
N5 is going next quarter?
No, N5 usually gets.
Spring, I mean, fall.
Well, Mignon Moore, who wrote one of the chapters in this book, and I usually alternate teaching the course. And I'm not sure whether she taught it this year or not. I'm teaching it now, and I'll probably teach it again next year, but typically when I teach it, it's in the winter or the spring. I think it's taught twice a year. Once by her, once by me. I believe that's what we're doing. Yeah.
Kind of relevant, but